The pretty little town of Melk, situated on the bank of the Danube, is dominated by an immense rock in the form of a promontory, on the top of which rises a Benedictine abbey that passes for the most beautiful and the richest in Christendom. From the rooms of the monastery, the eye takes in, over a very vast expanse, the course and the two banks of the Danube. The emperor and several marshals, among whom was Marshal Lannes, took up quarters in the monastery, and our staff lodged with the parish priest of the town. Much rain had fallen during the week, and the rain, which had not ceased for 24 hours, was still continuing. Thus the Danube and its numerous tributaries had overflowed. Night having come, my comrades and I, delighted to be sheltered from such wretched weather, were supping merrily with the priest, a jovial fellow who did the honours of an excellent meal, when the aide-de-camp on duty with Marshal Lannes came to inform me that the marshal wanted me, and that I must go up to the abbey at once. I was so comfortable where I was that I was very much annoyed at being obliged to leave a good supper and a good lodging to go and get soaked again. But I had to obey. All the corridors and all the lower halls of the monastery were filled with grenadiers and chasseurs of the guard, to whom the monk's good wine made the fatigues of the previous days forgotten. On arriving in the salons, I understood that I had been called for some grave reason, for generals, chamberlains, and ordnance officers all repeated to me, "The emperor has sent for you." Some added, "It is probably to hand you your commission as squadron leader." But I did not believe it, for I did not yet have enough importance with the sovereign for him to send for me at such an hour to give me my promotion with his own hand. I was therefore shown into an immense and magnificent gallery, whose balcony overlooks the Danube. I found the emperor dining there with several marshals and the abbot of the abbey, who bore the title of bishop. On seeing me, the emperor left the table and approached the great balcony, followed by Marshal Lannes, to whom I heard him say in a low voice, "The execution of this plan is almost impossible. It would be to send that brave officer uselessly to an almost certain death." "He will go, sire, I am certain of it," replied the marshal. "He will go. Besides, we can always put the proposal to him." Then, taking me by the hand, the marshal opened the window of the balcony, which looks far out over the Danube, whose immense width, tripled at that moment by a very heavy flood, was nearly a league. A most violent wind was lashing the river, whose waves we heard roaring. It was pouring with rain, and the night was extremely dark. Nevertheless, one could make out, on the other side, an immense line of bivouac fires. Napoleon, Marshal Lannes and I being alone by the balcony, the marshal said to me, "On the other side of the river there is an Austrian camp, but the emperor very much wishes to know whether General Hiller's corps is part of it, or whether it is still on this bank. To make sure, it would be necessary that a man of heart have the courage to cross the Danube in order to seize some enemy soldier, and I have assured the emperor that you will go." Napoleon then said to me, "Note well that this is not an order I am giving you, it is a wish I express. I recognize that the undertaking is most perilous, but you may refuse it without fear of displeasing me. Go then, reflect for a few moments in the next room, and come back to tell us frankly your decision." I will confess that, on hearing Marshal Lannes's proposal, a cold sweat drenched my whole body. But at that very instant, a feeling that I cannot define, in which love of glory and of my country was perhaps mingled with a noble pride, carried my ardor to the highest pitch, and I said to myself, "What? The emperor has here an army of 150,000 devoted warriors, as well as 25,000 men of his guard, all chosen from among the bravest. He is surrounded by aides-de-camp and ordnance officers. And yet, when it is a matter of an expedition that requires as much intelligence as intrepidity, it is me, that the emperor and the brave Marshal Lannes choose. I will go, sire," I cried without hesitation. "I will go, and if I perish, I bequeath my mother to your majesty." The emperor took my ear as a sign of satisfaction, and the marshal held out his hand, exclaiming, "I was quite right to tell your majesty that he would go." That is what is called a brave soldier. My expedition being thus resolved upon, it was necessary to think of assembling the means to carry it out. The Emperor sent for General Bertrand, his aide-de-camp, General d'Orsay of the Grenadiers of the Guard, as well as the commander of the Grand Imperial Headquarters, and ordered them to place at my disposal whatever I thought I would need. At my request, an infantry picket went into the town to fetch the burgomaster, the syndic of the boatmen, and 5 of his best sailors. A corporal and 5-foot grenadiers of the old guard, all speaking German and taken from among the bravest, though not yet decorated, were also called and willingly agreed to accompany me. The Emperor first had the 6 soldiers brought in, and having promised them that on their return they would immediately receive the cross, those brave fellows answered with a Vive l'Empereur and went to get ready. As for the 5 boatmen, when the interpreter had explained to them that the matter was to take a boat to the other side of the Danube, they fell to their knees and began to weep. The syndic declared that it would be as well to shoot them on the spot as to send them to certain death. The expedition was absolutely impossible, not only because the force of the waters would capsize the craft, but also because, the tributaries of the Danube having brought into the river a great quantity of fir trees newly felled in the neighboring mountains, those trunks, which one could not avoid in the darkness, would come and strike and stove in the boat. Besides, how could one land on the opposite bank, amid the willows that would pierce the hull, and in a flood the extent of which was unknown? The syndic therefore concluded that the operation was materially impracticable. In vain did the Emperor, to entice them, have 6,000 francs in gold laid out before each of them. That offer could not decide them, and yet they said, "We are poor boatmen, all fathers of families. That gold would secure our fortune and that of our children. Our refusal must therefore prove to you the impossibility of crossing the river at this moment. I have already said, in war, the necessity of sparing the lives of a great number of men by sacrificing those of a few makes the chiefs of the army, in certain circumstances, pitiless. The Emperor was therefore inflexible. The grenadiers received orders to take those poor men along in spite of themselves, and we went down into the town. The corporal who had been assigned to me was a very intelligent man. I took him for my interpreter and charged him, on the way, to tell the syndic of the boatmen that, since he was being forced to come with us, he ought, in his own interest, to designate the best boat and to point out all the items with which it should be furnished. The unfortunate man obeyed, while giving himself up to the most frightful despair. We therefore had an excellent craft, and we took from the others whatever suited our convenience. We had 2 anchors, but as it seemed scarcely possible to me that we could use them, I had ropes taken and had a piece of canvas sewn to the end of each, in which a large stone was wrapped. I had seen, in the south of France, fishermen stop their boats by throwing onto the willows at the water's edge ropes thus prepared which, twisting around those trees, served as anchors and held the skiff. I covered my head with a kepi, and the grenadiers put on their fatigue caps, for any other headgear would have been very troublesome. We had provisions, ropes, axes, saws, a ladder. In short, everything that foresight suggested I should take. Our preparations completed, I was about to give the signal to depart, when the 5 boatmen begged me, sobbing, to have my soldiers take them to their homes, and to grant them the favor of going, perhaps for the last time, to embrace their wives and children. But the emotion that such a scene would have produced could only have further weakened the already feeble courage of those wretches, and I refused. "Well then," said the syndic, "since we have only a few moments to live, give us 5 minutes to commend our souls to God, and do as we do, for you are going to perish as well." They all prostrated themselves. The grenadiers and I imitated them, which seemed to give those good men great pleasure. The prayer ended. I had a glass of the monk's excellent wine given to each of them, and the boat was pushed off into the stream. I had recommended to the grenadiers that they carry out in silence all the syndic's instructions, he being at the helm. The current was too swift for us to cross directly from Melk to the opposite bank. We therefore sailed up along the river bank for more than a league, and although the wind and the waves made the boat leap, that passage was made without accident. But when at last we had to stand out from shore to begin the crossing by dint of rowing, the mast that we struck down, instead of coming to lie along the length of the boat, fell to the side, and the sail, dipping into the water, offered great resistance to the current, which made us heel so much that we were on the point of being swamped. The skipper ordered the cables cut and the mast thrown into the river, but the boatmen, losing their heads, began to pray without moving. Then the corporal, drawing his sabre, said to them, "One can pray while working. If you do not obey on the spot, I will kill you." Those poor devils, obliged to choose between an uncertain death and a certain one, took axes and helped the grenadiers. The mast was quickly cut and cast into the current. It was just in time, for hardly were we rid of that dangerous burden when we felt a dreadful shock. One of the many fir trunks carried along by the Danube had just struck the boat. We all shuddered. Fortunately, the planking had not yet been stove in, but would the craft withstand the blows it might receive from other trees that we could not see, whose proximity was signalled by a greater heaving of the waves? Several touched us, without causing serious damage. However, the current pushing us hard, and our oars gaining very little against it to give us the necessary slant for crossing the river, I feared for a moment that it would carry us beyond the enemy camp, which would have caused my expedition to fail. At last, by dint of rowing, we had covered 3/4 of the passage, when, despite the darkness, I made out an enormous black mass on the water. Then, suddenly, there was a sharp rustling, branches struck our faces, and the boat stopped. The skipper, questioned, replied that we were on an islet covered with willows and poplars, the flood having almost reached their tops. We had to use axes, groping, to open a passage through those branches. We succeeded, and as soon as we had cleared that obstacle, we found a current far less furious than in the middle of the river, and at last we reached the left bank, opposite the Austrian camp. That bank was lined with very thick water trees, which, arching in a dome over the edge, no doubt made the approach very difficult, but, at the same time, kept our boat from being seen from the camp. The bivouac fires lit the shore, while leaving us in the darkness cast upon us by the willow branches. I let the boat run along the edge, searching with my eyes for a spot suitable for landing. All at once, I saw a ramp cut into the bank by the enemy, so that the men and horses of their camp could reach the water. The clever corporal then threw among the willows one of the stones I had prepared. The rope wound itself around one of those trees, and the boat stopped against the earth, 1 or 2 feet from the ramp. I think it was then midnight. The Austrians, separated from the French by the immensity of the flooded Danube, were in such great security that except for the sentry, everything in the camp was asleep. In war, it is customary that, whatever the distance from the enemy, the guns and the sentries must always face him. A battery placed in front of the camp was therefore turned toward the river, and sentries were pacing along the top of the bank, whose trees prevented them from seeing the very edge, whereas from the boat I could see, through the branches, a great part of the bivouacs. Up to that point, my mission had gone better than I could have hoped, but for the result to be complete, a prisoner had to be taken, and such an operation, carried out within 50 paces of several thousand enemies whom a single cry could awaken, seemed to me very difficult. Nevertheless, I had to act. I therefore ordered the 5 boatmen to lie down in the bottom of the boat, warning them that 2 grenadiers would watch them and would pitilessly kill anyone who uttered a word or tried to get up. I placed another grenadier on the point of the boat nearest the bank, and, putting my sabre in my hand, I disembarked, followed by the corporal and 2 grenadiers. The boat fell short of the land by a few feet. We were therefore obliged to walk in the water, but at last we were on the ramp. We climbed it, and I was preparing to rush upon the nearest sentry, to disarm him, gag him, and drag him to the boat, when a metallic sound and a little half-voiced song struck my ears. A man carrying a big tin can was coming, humming to draw water. We went quickly back down toward the river to hide under the vault of branches that covered the boat, and as soon as the Austrian bent down to fill his can, my corporal and the 2 grenadiers seized him by the throat, placed over his mouth a handkerchief filled with wet sand, and, setting the points of their sabres to his body, threatened to kill him if he offered the least resistance or tried to utter a cry. Stupefied, the man obeyed and let himself be led to the boat. We hoisted him up into the arms of the grenadier posted there, and he made him lie flat beside the boatman. While that Austrian was being taken, his dress made me recognize that he was not a soldier, properly speaking, but an officer's soldier servant. I would have preferred to take a fighting man, for I would have had more definite information. Nevertheless, for lack of better, I was about to content myself with that capture when I saw, at the top of the ramp, 2 soldiers carrying, each by one end, a pole from which a kettle hung. Those men being now only a few steps away, it was impossible to re-embark without being seen. I therefore signed to my grenadiers to hide again, and when those 2 Austrians bent down to fill their pot, strong arms seized them from behind and plunged their heads into the water, because, those soldiers having their sabres, I feared they would resist. It was necessary then to stun them. Then, as each was raised, his mouth was covered with a handkerchief filled with sand, and sword blades placed on his chest compelled him to follow us. They were taken on board in succession as the servant had been, and I got back on board, followed by the corporal and the 2 grenadiers. So far, everything was going admirably well. I had the boatmen rise, they took up their oars, and I ordered the corporal to untie the end of the rope that held us to the bank. But it was so wet, and the hard strain of the boat that it held, in spite of the violence of the current, had so tightened the knot that it became impossible to undo it. We were obliged to saw through the rope, which took us 2 or 3 minutes. But the efforts we made, having set the cable, whose end was wound around a willow, in great motion, the branches of that tree shook those around it. The result was a rustling loud enough to attract the sentry's attention. The man came closer and did not see the boat, but seeing the agitation of the branches and the noise increasing, he cried, "Where da?" "Who goes there?" No answer. Another challenge from the enemy sentry. We still kept silence, continuing our work. I was in mortal anguish, for, after having braved so many perils, it would truly have been cruel to fail in the harbour. At last, the rope was cut and the boat was pushed off. But hardly was it outside the vault formed above us by the willows, when, lit by the glow of the bivouac fires, it was seen by the Austrian sentry, who shouted, "To arms!" and fired at us. No one was hit, but at that sound all the troops in the camp sprang up, and the gunners, whose pieces, trained on the Danube, were all loaded, did me the honor of firing their cannon at my boat. My heart leapt for joy at the sound of that detonation, which must have been heard by the Emperor and by Marshal Lanz. My eyes turned toward the Abbey of Melk, whose numerous lit windows I had not ceased to make out despite the distance. They were probably all thrown open that instant, but the light from one of them seemed to grow brighter, that of the immense balcony window, which, thanks to its dimensions, like those of a church portal, cast far out a great brightness over the waters of the river. It was evident that it had just been opened on hearing the cannon thunder, and I said to myself, "The Emperor and the marshals are certainly on that balcony. They know I have reached the left bank in the enemy camp, and they are praying for my return." That thought, heightening my courage still more, made me pay no attention to the cannonballs, which, moreover, were not very dangerous, for the rapidity of the current carried us with such speed that the enemy gunners could not aim with precision at so mobile an object, and one would have had to be very unlucky for them to strike our craft. It is true that a single ball could have shattered it and plunged us into the abyss, but all were lost in the Danube. I soon found myself out of range of the enemy, and could begin to hope that my enterprise would have a fortunate outcome. Yet all perils had not been overcome, for we had to recross the river, which was still rolling down pine trunks, and we were several times thrown upon submerged islands where the poplar branches held us up for a long time. At last, we managed to draw near the right bank, more than 2 leagues below Melk. Here a new fear assailed me. I made out bivouac fires, and nothing assured me that they belonged to a French regiment, for the enemy had troops on both banks, and I knew that on the right bank Marshal Lannes's vanguard was a short distance from Melk, opposite an Austrian force posted at St. Pölten. Our army was doubtless to advance at daybreak, but was it already occupying that place, and were the fires I saw surrounded by friends or by enemies? I feared that the current had carried me too far downstream, but I was delivered from my perplexity by the sound of several trumpets, which was sounding reveille for the French cavalry. Then, all uncertainty ceasing, we pulled hard for the shore, where the dawn allowed us to make out a village. We were not far from it when a carbine shot was heard, and a bullet whistled past our ears. It was evident that the French post was taking us for an enemy boat. I had not foreseen this case, and did not quite know how we would manage to have ourselves recognized, when I had the happy idea of having my 6 grenadiers frequently shout, "Long live Emperor Napoleon!" That certainly did not suffice to prove that we were French, but it would nevertheless attract the officers' attention, who, surrounded by many soldiers, could not fear our small number, and would doubtless prevent anyone from firing on us before knowing whether we were French or Austrian. In fact, a few moments later, I was received on the bank by Colonel Gautrin and the 9th Hussars, belonging to Marshal Lannes's corps. Had we landed half a league farther downstream, we would have fallen into the enemy posts. The Hussar colonel lent me a horse and had several wagons provided, on which I placed the grenadiers, the boatmen, and the prisoners. Then the little caravan set off for Melk. During that journey, the corporal, by my order, questioning the 3 Austrians, I learned with joy that the camp from which I had just taken them belonged to General Hiller's corps, the very one whose position the Emperor so ardently wished to know. Thus, there was no longer any doubt. General Hiller had joined Prince Charles on the other side of the Danube. There could therefore no longer be any question of a battle on the road we occupied, and Napoleon, having before him only the enemy cavalry posted in front of St. Pölten, could safely push his troops on to Vienna, which was only 3 short marches away. Having obtained this information, I put my horse to the gallop, to carry it as quickly as possible to the Emperor. It was broad daylight when I reached the monastery gate. I found its approaches blocked by the entire population of the little town of Melk, in the midst of which could be heard the heart-rending cries of the wives, children, parents, and friends of the boatmen taken away the previous evening. I was immediately surrounded by those good people, whose keen anxieties I calmed by saying to them, in very bad German, "Your relatives and friends are alive, and you will see them in a few moments." An immense cry of joy then arose from the crowd. The French officer in charge of guarding the gates appeared, and, as soon as he saw me, he ran, as he had been ordered, to have the aides-de-camp on duty inform the Emperor of my arrival. In an instant, everyone in the palace was on their feet. The good Marshal Lannes came to me, embraced me cordially, and led me at once to the Emperor, exclaiming, "Here he is. Sire, I knew he would return. He brings 3 prisoners from General Hiller's corps. Napoleon received me in the best possible manner, and, although I was soaked and spattered with mud from head to foot, he laid his hand on my shoulder, not forgetting his greatest mark of satisfaction, the pinch of the ear. I leave you to judge how many questions I was asked. The Emperor wished to know in detail everything that had happened to me during my perilous enterprise, and when I had finished my account, His Majesty said to me, "I am very pleased with you, Squadron Leader Marbot." Those words being equivalent to a commission, I was beside myself with joy. A chamberlain having announced at that moment that the Emperor was served, I was counting on waiting in the gallery until he had left the table, when Napoleon, pointing out the dining room to me, said, "You will breakfast with me." I was all the more flattered by that honor in that it had never been accorded to any officer of my rank. During breakfast, I learned that the Emperor and the marshals had not gone to bed, and that, on hearing the cannon thunder on the opposite bank, they had all rushed to the balcony. The emperor had me repeat how I had surprised the 3 prisoners, and laughed heartily at the fear and astonishment they must have felt. At last, it was announced that the wagons had arrived, but could scarcely enter the abbey, so eager was the crowd of Melk's inhabitants to see the boatmen. Napoleon, finding that eagerness very natural, ordered the gates to be opened and everyone admitted to the courtyard. A few moments later, the grenadiers, the boatmen, and the prisoners were brought into the gallery. The emperor, having his interpreter at his side, had the 3 Austrian soldiers questioned first, and, learning with satisfaction that not only General Hiller's corps, but Prince Charles and his whole army were on the left bank, he instructed Prince Berthier to order all the troops to march at once on St. Pölten, where he was going to follow them. Then, calling up the brave corporal and the 5 soldiers of his guard, he placed the cross of the Legion of Honor on their chests, named them Knights of the Empire, and granted each of them an endowment of 1,200 francs in annuity. All those old moustaches wept for joy. It was then the boatmen's turn, to whom the emperor had it said that, the dangers they had faced being much greater than he had first thought, it was only just that he increased their reward. That, consequently, instead of the 6,000 francs promised, they were each going to receive 12,000, which were handed to them on the spot, in gold. Nothing could express those good men's delight. They kissed the hands of the emperor and of all present, crying, "We are rich now." Napoleon, seeing their joy, had it asked of the syndic, laughing, whether, at such a price, he would undertake a similar voyage the next night. But the man replied that, having escaped by a miracle from a death he had considered certain, he would not undertake such a journey amid the same perils, even if the Lord Abbot of Melk were to give him the monastery and the immense properties dependent on it. The boatmen withdrew, blessing the generosity of the Emperor of the French, and the grenadiers, impatient to make their decorations shine in the eyes of their comrades, were about to leave, taking their 3 prisoners with them, when Napoleon noticed that the Austrian servant was weeping hot tears. He had him reassured as to the fate that awaited him. That poor fellow replied, sobbing, that he knew very well the French treated their prisoners very well, but that, carrying on his person a belt containing almost all his captain's fortune, he feared that this officer would accuse him of having deserted in order to steal it. That thought tore his heart. The emperor, moved by that honest man's despair, had it said to him that he was free, and that, in 2 days, as soon as we were before Vienna, he would be passed through the outposts, so that he could return to his master. Then Napoleon, taking from his casket a roll of 1,000 francs, put it into the servant's hand, saying, "Virtue must be honored wherever it appears." Finally, the emperor gave a few gold pieces to each of the 2 other prisoners, ordering that they also be returned to the Austrian outposts, so as to make them forget the fright we had caused them, and so that it could not be said that soldiers, even enemies, had spoken to the Emperor of the French without receiving some benefit. That concludes the 13th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.